Come close, sit down, let your shoulders drop for a moment, because what I want to say to you tonight cannot be heard by a body that is still standing guard at its own door. I want to ask you something before I say anything else. When was the last time you closed your eyes, not to sleep, not to escape a headache, not to avoid someone's face, but simply to listen to what is happening inside your own chest? Can you remember? Because most of us cannot. We have become experts at looking outward. We can describe the architecture of a mosque we visited 20 years ago in more detail than we can describe the last time our own heart trembled. We know the exact tile pattern on the dome of a shrine, the exact color of the carpet in a temple, the exact smell of incense in a place we call holy, and yet we could not tell you with the same certainty what our own soul smells like, what color it is, what pattern it makes when it is at peace. This is the strange sickness of being human. We built houses for God, and then we forgot that God had already built a house in us first. Let me say the title again, slowly, because titles like this one are not meant to be read quickly. God is within your heart. So what are you searching for in mosques and temples? Notice this is not an insult to mosques. It is not an insult to temples. It is not asking you to stop going. It is asking you a much harder question. What exactly are you hoping to find there that you have not yet found in yourself? Because if the answer is God, then I have to tell you something that every mystic, every wandering dervish, every barefoot saint who ever sat in silence by a river has tried to tell humanity in 1,000 different languages. You will not find him out there if you have not first found the door to him in here. There is an old story, the kind that gets passed from one Sufi gathering to another like a coin worn smooth by many hands. A man spent his entire life searching for treasure. He had heard in a dream that a great fortune was buried near a bridge in a faraway city. So he left his home, walked for weeks, crossed rivers and deserts, and finally arrived at the bridge. He dug, he searched, he found nothing. Exhausted, he sat down and wept. A guard passing by asked him why he was crying, and the man told him the whole story, the dream, the bridge, the treasure. The guard laughed and said, I too have had a recurring dream, of a treasure buried under the floor of a poor man's house, in a city far from here, but I am not foolish enough to travel that far for a dream. And he described, without knowing it, the very house the traveler had left behind. The man rushed home, dug beneath his own floor, and found the treasure that had been sitting under his feet the entire time. This story is told in different forms in different traditions, but the Sufis loved it because it says something they had already discovered through centuries of prayer and fasting and heartbreak. The thing you are looking for is not far away. It is not in Mecca or Varanasi or Jerusalem or any single point on a map. It is in the very ground you are standing on right now, if only you would stop walking long enough to dig. I want you to think about why we built mosques and temples in the first place. Was it because God needed a house? Does the creator of galaxies, the one who spun 100 billion stars into being without lifting a hand, require 4 walls and a roof to exist? Of course not. We built these places because we needed them. We are forgetful creatures. We are creatures who get lost in traffic and bills and arguments and heartbreaks, and we needed a physical reminder, a place we could walk into that would say, without words, stop, remember. You are not just meat and bone and worry, you are something else too. The building was never meant to contain God. It was meant to contain our attention long enough for us to remember that God was never separate from us to begin with. But something happened along the way. Something always happens along the way, doesn't it? The reminder became the destination. The finger pointing at the moon became mistaken for the moon itself. We started arguing about whose reminder was better, whose building was holier, whose direction of prayer was more correct. And in all that arguing we forgot to actually do the one thing the building was built for, to remember. The Sufis have a phrase for this, and I want you to sit with it because it is not a small thing. They call the ego, the small self, the noisy voice inside you that always wants to be right, always wants to be seen, always wants more. They call it the veil. Not a wall, a veil. A wall would be permanent, unmovable, something you could blame forever. But a veil is thin. A veil moves with the wind. A veil can be lifted. And this is the whole of the mystical teaching. If you strip away every poem and every parable and every whirling dance, God is not absent from you. You are veiled from God by your own noise. Think about a mirror covered in dust. The mirror has not lost its capacity to reflect light. Nothing about the mirror itself has changed. It is simply covered. Wipe the dust away, and the reflection was always there, waiting. This is what the great masters meant when they said the heart is a mirror for the divine. Your heart, right now, at this very moment, has the capacity to reflect something infinite. But it is covered in the dust of 1,000 small angers, old grudges, unspoken jealousies, unexamined fears, and the endless exhausting performance of trying to look good in front of people who are themselves too busy performing to even notice you. You go to the mosque, and you kneel, and you say the words, and some part of you is already checking whether the person next to you noticed how devoutly you knelt. You go to the temple, and you light the lamp, and you fold your hands, and some part of you is composing, without even meaning to, the version of this moment you will describe to someone later to prove your own goodness. I am not condemning you for this. I do it too. Every human being does it, because the ego is clever, and its favorite trick is to disguise itself as devotion. It will follow you into the holiest room in the world and whisper, "Look how holy you are being right now." And the moment you listen to that whisper, the mirror gets dusty again, right there in the middle of your prayer. This is why the Sufis were often so suspicious of empty ritual. Not because ritual is bad. Ritual, done with a clean heart, is one of the most beautiful things a human being can do. But ritual done as performance, ritual done to be seen, ritual done because everyone else is doing it, and you are afraid of what they will think if you don't, that kind of ritual is just theater. It is a body moving in the shape of devotion, while the heart, the actual seat of the divine, sits locked in a drawer somewhere, untouched. There is a story about a woman named Rabia, one of the earliest and most fiercely loving mystics in the Sufi tradition. She was seen one day running through the streets of Basra, carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. Someone stopped her and asked what she was doing. She said, "I am going to set fire to paradise and pour water on the flames of hell, so that people will stop worshipping God out of fear of punishment or hope of reward, and instead learn to love Him simply because He is worthy of love." Read that again. She was not against paradise. She was not against the idea of hell as a moral compass for those who need one. What she was against was a love so transactional that it could not exist without a prize at the end of it. She wanted a love so pure it needed no mosque, no temple, no witness, no reward, a love that existed simply because the lover could not help loving. This is the kind of love that lives inside your own chest right now, buried under years of transactional thinking. We have been taught, so many of us, that love is a business deal. I will love you if you love me back. I will be good if goodness gets me somewhere. I will pray if prayer gets me what I want. And slowly, without noticing, we turned even our relationship with the divine into a marketplace. We show up at the mosque or the temple the way we show up at a bank, to make a deposit, to check our balance, to withdraw a favor. But God, if God is anything like what the mystics describe, is not a banker. God is closer to you than the artery in your own neck, closer than your own breath, closer than the thought you are having right now as you listen to me. You cannot do business with something that close. You can only recognize it. I want to tell you about Shams of Tabriz, the wandering dervish who changed the life of a respected scholar named Jalaluddin Rumi forever. Before Shams arrived, Rumi was already a great teacher, learned, respected, surrounded by students, admired for his knowledge of scripture and law. He knew about God the way a man might know about the ocean from reading books about it. The depth, the temperature, the currents, all of it correct, all of it borrowed. Then Shams arrived, a wild and unkempt stranger nobody trusted, and asked Rumi a question so simple it nearly broke him. He asked about the difference between the knowledge of a great scholar and the direct burning experience of a man who has actually touched the divine. Rumi did not have an answer, and in that gap, in that silence where his borrowed knowledge failed him, something in him cracked open. He stopped being a man who talked about the ocean, and became a man who jumped into it. He stopped writing careful, correct sentences about God, and began speaking in poems so alive they still make people weep in languages he never spoke, 700 years after his body returned to the earth. What changed was not his address. He did not move to a holier city. He did not build a taller minaret. What changed was the direction of his search. He stopped looking for God in the pages of other people's books, and started looking for God in the trembling, uncontainable love that had been sitting inside his own chest the entire time, waiting for someone wild enough to shake it loose. I ask you now, gently, without any judgment at all, what is sitting inside your chest, waiting to be shaken loose? What have you been outsourcing to a building that was always yours to carry? Let's talk about the word search itself, because I think we have misunderstood it. We treat searching as a journey with geography. A road you walk, a mountain you climb, a shrine you finally reach after years of pilgrimage, and then you arrive, and the searching is over. But the mystics describe a very different kind of search. They describe it as a journey inward, a spiral that goes down and down through the layers of who you pretend to be, past the layer that wants approval, past the layer that is afraid of death, past the layer that still remembers every insult ever spoken to it, down to a place so quiet and so old that it existed before you were even born into this particular body. And at the very center of that spiral, they say, sitting patiently, is the very thing you have been circling mosques and temples looking for. The Persian poets had a beautiful image for this. They spoke of the beloved as a candle, and the seeker as a moth. But notice, the moth does not need to travel to a distant country to find the candle. The candle is often burning in the very room the moth has been flying around in circles, afraid to land, afraid to be consumed. That fear of being consumed, that fear of surrender, is the real obstacle. Not distance, not geography. Fear. Surrender is a word that frightens people, especially in a world that has taught us to prize control above almost everything else. We are told from childhood to achieve, to plan, to manage, to hold the reins tightly. So when a mystic tells you the path to God runs through surrender, something in you recoils, because surrender sounds like losing. But the surrender the Sufis speak of is not defeat, it is not giving up on life. It is giving up the exhausting illusion that you were ever fully in control to begin with. It is putting down a weight you were never strong enough to carry alone, and discovering in the moment you finally set it down, that something larger than you was holding you the entire time, the way the ocean holds a swimmer who finally stops thrashing and lets herself float. Have you ever noticed how a small child, before the world teaches her to be afraid, does not search for God anywhere? She simply is. She laughs without needing a reason. She cries without shame, and forgets the sorrow within minutes. She looks at an ant on the ground with the same wide, uncomplicated wonder she looks at the moon. Some of the old teachers said that this unguarded wonder, this presence without performance, is the closest thing on earth to what they meant by nearness to God. Not because children are innocent in some naive way, but because they have not yet built the elaborate architecture of ego that adults spend their whole lives defending. They have not yet learned to perform their prayers for an audience. They pray, when they pray, the way they do everything else, completely, without a second thought about how it looks. Somewhere between that unguarded childhood and this room where you and I are sitting now, most of us built walls. We built them out of the necessary wounds of growing up, the betrayals, the disappointments, the times we were told we were too much or not enough. And each wall was meant to protect something soft inside us. But walls do not know the difference between danger and love. A wall built to keep out cruelty will also, without meaning to, keep out grace. And so we walk around as adults, fortified, careful, managed, and then we wonder why the mosque feels empty, why the temple feels like stone instead of sanctuary. It is not that the sanctuary lost its power. It is that we arrived there still wearing all our armor, and armor cannot feel a caress, no matter how gentle the hand offering it. This is why the Sufis placed such enormous importance on the breaking of the heart. Not the breaking of the body through harsh discipline for its own sake, though many of them did fast and stay awake through long nights, but the breaking of the false, protected, performing self. They believed, and taught this over and over in 100 different metaphors, that the heart must crack before the light can enter. A heart that has never been broken is a heart still sealed shut, still convinced it does not need anything beyond itself. But a heart that has been broken, by loss, by love, by disappointment, by the death of someone irreplaceable, by the failure of every plan you were so sure of, that heart has a crack in it now, an opening, and it is precisely through that opening, and only through that opening, that something greater can finally get in. If you are sitting here tonight nursing a wound, if something in your life recently cracked you open in a way that still aches when you touch it, I want you to hear this clearly. That crack is not evidence that God has abandoned you. In the old teaching it is often the exact opposite. It may be the very place where the light is about to come through. Hanikil, let's return for a moment to the mosque and the temple, because I don't want you to think I am telling you to abandon them. That is not the point of this at all. The point is much more precise than that, and much more demanding. The mystics were not anti-ritual. Many of the greatest of them prayed 5 times a day with more devotion than the most rigid formalist, and many others sang in temples until their voices gave out. What they insisted on, relentlessly, was that the outer form must be married to an inner reality, or else it becomes an empty shell, beautiful perhaps, architecturally impressive, historically significant, but empty. The way a beautiful body without breath is no longer a person, but only a shape that once held one. Think of the outer practice, the bowing, the chanting, the pilgrimage, the fasting, as the shape of a cup. A cup is a useful thing. A cup has a purpose. But a cup's purpose is not to be admired for its shape. A cup exists to be filled. You can have the most exquisitely carved cup in the world, gold-rimmed, ancient, blessed by 100 saints, and if it is never filled with water, it will do nothing for a thirsty man. Likewise, you can perform the most technically perfect prayer, follow every rule of ritual precisely, visit every holy site on the map, and if your heart is not present, if the water of real longing and real love is not poured into the shape of the ritual, you will walk away from the holiest building on earth exactly as thirsty as when you arrived. So when I ask what you are searching for in mosques and temples, I am really asking whether you have confused the cup for the water. I am asking whether you have spent years perfecting the shape of your devotion while forgetting to actually fill it with the trembling, unguarded, undignified longing that real love for the divine requires. Undignified, I chose that word carefully, because the mystics were often willing to look foolish for love in a way that respectable religious people found scandalous. They danced in the streets, they wept in public. They spoke to God the way a lover speaks to a beloved, sometimes tender, sometimes furious, sometimes teasing, always intimate. They were not interested in looking composed. They understood something we have largely forgotten in our era of curated, camera-ready spirituality, that real intimacy is never tidy. Real longing does not care how it looks. If you have ever truly missed someone, not politely missed them, but ached for them in your bones, you know that this feeling has no interest in your dignity. It just wants the person. This is exactly the kind of aching the mystics believed we were capable of feeling for the divine, if only we would stop managing our spiritual lives like a professional resume and start living them like a love affair. Now someone listening to me might think this sounds like an excuse to stop going anywhere, to stop doing anything, to sit at home and call it spirituality while doing nothing at all. That is not what I am saying, and the great masters would not have said it either. The inward journey is not an excuse for laziness. In fact, it is far more demanding than any outward pilgrimage, because you cannot fool yourself the way you can fool a crowd. You can walk into a mosque and have everyone believe you are the most devoted person in the room, while your heart is somewhere else entirely. But you cannot walk into your own heart and lie to yourself about what you find there. The inward journey demands a brutal, unflinching honesty that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, because it is far easier to kneel in a public building than to sit alone in silence and face what is actually inside you. This is perhaps the real reason so many of us fill our lives with outward religious activity, not out of insincerity, but out of a very human fear of stillness. Stillness has a way of surfacing everything we have been avoiding. The moment the noise stops, the moment there is no ritual to perform, no crowd to move with, no words to recite, something else rises up. Old grief, unspoken anger, the ache of a question we have never dared to ask ourselves. It is far more comfortable to stay busy in the outer forms of devotion than to sit in the terrifying quiet where the real work begins. But the mystics tell us, again and again, in image after image, that this terrifying quiet is exactly where the treasure is buried, not somewhere else. Not in a more sacred building, not in a more impressive pilgrimage. Right there, in the stillness you have been avoiding your whole life. I think of the story of Moses and the burning bush, a story shared across so many traditions that it has become almost universal. God did not appear to Moses in a temple built by human hands. He appeared in a bush, on an ordinary mountainside, in the middle of an ordinary day, while Moses was doing the ordinary work of tending sheep. And the instruction given to him in that moment was strange and specific. Take off your sandals, for the ground you are standing on is holy. Not the ground somewhere else, not the ground of a future temple not yet built. This ground, right here, right now, under your own tired feet. I think about this often, because it suggests something almost scandalous by the standards of institutional religion. Holiness is not confined to consecrated buildings, it can erupt anywhere a human being is finally paying full attention. What would it mean for you to take off your sandals right now, wherever you are sitting? What would it mean to recognize that the ground beneath your ordinary, unremarkable day, the kitchen where you make your tea, the road where you walk to work, the quiet minute before sleep when your mind finally stops arguing with itself, what would it mean to recognize that this ground too might be holy? Not because you built something impressive there, but because you finally noticed. I want to tell you about a farmer, a story that circulates in Sufi teaching circles in different versions, sometimes with different names, but always with the same bones. A famous scholar traveled far to visit a man said to be a great saint, expecting to find him deep in prayer, perhaps fasting, perhaps surrounded by disciples. Instead, he found the man plowing his field, sweat on his back, hands in the dirt. The scholar, disappointed, asked him when he found time to worship God. The farmer looked at him and said something like, Every furrow I plow is a prayer. Every seed I plant remembering the one who makes it grow. I have not left my prayer even for a moment. I have simply stopped confining it to a mat. The scholar returned home a changed man, having traveled a great distance to learn that the destination was never the point. This is the heart of what I am trying to say to you tonight, and I want to say it plainly, without more metaphors for a moment, because sometimes the plain truth needs room to breathe. The divine you are looking for is not withholding itself from you, hiding behind the walls of some more sacred building, waiting for you to travel far enough, suffer enough, perform enough to earn a glimpse. The divine, according to the deepest teaching of the mystics across so many traditions, is already nearer to you than your own pulse. What separates you from that nearness is not distance, it is noise, it is the ego's endless performance. It is the dust on the mirror, it is the armor built around an old wound. It is the habit of outsourcing your spiritual life to a building instead of doing the harder, quieter, more honest work of clearing space within yourself. So what do you do with this? Because a truth without a practice is just a nice thought that evaporates by morning. Start with attention, not grand spiritual attention, not the kind that requires incense and candlelight, but the ordinary attention you give to the people and moments you actually love. Notice your own breath for 60 seconds without trying to change it. Notice the specific weight of your body in the chair you are sitting in. Notice the sensation in your chest when you think of someone you love, and sit with that sensation instead of rushing past it toward the next thought. This sounds too simple to matter, and yet almost every mystical tradition insists that this simple, unglamorous attention is the doorway, not complicated theology, not years of scholarship, attention, presence. The willingness to actually be where you are instead of being 3 worries ahead or 10 regrets behind. Then if you do walk into a mosque or a temple, and I hope you do, because these places, built with love by generations who longed for exactly what you are longing for, deserve to be visited, walk in with a different question than the one you have carried before. Instead of asking, what can I get here? Ask, what in me is ready to be uncovered here? Instead of performing devotion for the people around you, let the walls of that building simply remind you of what you already carry. The way a photograph of someone you love does not create the love, but reminds you it was always there. And when you leave that building, carry the reminder with you into the rest of your life, because this is where most of us fail. We leave our devotion inside the 4 walls we visited, folded up neatly like the prayer mat we packed away, and we walk back out into our ordinary lives as if God only lived inside that particular structure. But if the mystics are right, and I believe with everything in me that they are, then the divine did not stay behind in that building when you walked out. The divine walked out with you, because the divine was never contained by the building to begin with. It was contained all along in the very heart that carried you there and carried you home again. Let me tell you about another kind of traveler, because not every seeker in this tradition was a scholar or a poet. Some were kings, and their stories are in a strange way more sobering than any of the others, because they show us that none of the outer trappings of a successful life, wealth, power, admiration, can substitute for the one thing we are talking about tonight. There is an old tale of a ruler who had everything a person could want. His treasury overflowed, his armies were feared, his palace had 100 rooms, each more beautiful than the last, and yet he could not sleep at night. He would wander his own palace in the dark hours, restless, searching the 100 rooms one by one as if he had misplaced something, though he could never say what. One night, wandering the grounds outside the palace walls, he came upon a wandering dervish sleeping under a tree with nothing but a torn blanket and an old wooden bowl. The king, envious in a way he could not explain, woke the man and asked him the secret of his peace. The dervish opened one eye, looked at the king's fine robes, and said, "I have already found what you are still building rooms to hide from." The king asked what that was. The dervish said, "Contentment. It does not live in 100 rooms. It lives in the one room you have never bothered to visit, the room inside your own chest." The king, it is said, gave away half his kingdom that year, not out of guilt, but because he finally understood that he had been trying to buy, with gold and marble, something that had never been for sale, because it had never actually left his own possession. I tell you this story because I suspect some of you listening tonight are in your own way that king. Not necessarily wealthy in gold, but wealthy in achievement, in reputation, in the 100 rooms of a well-managed life, a good job, a respectable family name, a calendar full of religious observances performed on schedule, and still, somewhere beneath all of it, unable to sleep, wandering your own life in the dark, searching for a room you cannot quite locate. I want to tell you, as gently and as clearly as I can, that the room you are searching for is not going to be found by adding one more achievement, one more pilgrimage, one more building to your list. It was never lost, it was only ever unvisited. There is a particular tension the Sufis wrote about endlessly, a tension between what they called akul, the reasoning mind, and ishq, the burning, illogical, often inconvenient force of love. The reasoning mind is not the enemy here, do not mistake me. The mind that calculates, that plans, that keeps you safe crossing a busy road, is a gift, and no honest mystic ever asked you to throw it away. But the reasoning mind has a limit, and that limit sits exactly at the border of the divine. You cannot think your way into the experience of being loved by the ocean of existence itself, any more than you can calculate your way into falling in love with another human being. At some point, thinking has to set down its tools and let something less orderly take over. This is why so many of the greatest mystics were also, by the standards of their more rigid contemporaries, a little scandalous. They spoke of God the way lovers speak of each other, hungry, impatient, sometimes even accusing, always intimate, because they understood that love, real love, does not proceed by careful argument. It proceeds by surrender, by risk, by the willingness to look foolish for the sake of something that cannot be proven, only felt. Have you ever noticed how, in ordinary human love, the people who love most fully are rarely the most composed? The parent who cannot stop checking on a sick child through the night is not being logical. The person who drives 3 hours after midnight because someone they love is in pain is not being efficient. Love, wherever it appears, tends to override the neat architecture of reason, and this is not a flaw in love, it is love's very signature. The mystics believed this same signature marks the relationship between a human soul and its source. If your devotion has never once made you feel a little foolish, a little too much, a little embarrassingly sincere in a world that prizes cool detachment, it might be worth asking whether you have actually let yourself love at all, or whether you have only ever managed the appearance of it. There is an image the poets return to again and again, the image of wine and the tavern, and I want to be careful here, because it was never a literal invitation to drunkenness. It was a metaphor for a particular kind of intoxication, the loss of the small, calculating, self-protective self in favor of something larger, freer, less afraid. The tavern, in their poems, was not a den of sin. It was strangely a truer house of worship than many a mosque built only of stone, because in the tavern of the poem, no one was pretending. No one was performing piety for the neighbors. Everyone sitting there had already admitted they were thirsty, and that admission, that raw, undignified honesty, was to the mystic's eye closer to real prayer than 1,000 recitations performed with a guarded heart. What they were really saying, beneath the wine and the metaphor, is this: God is not impressed by your composure. God is moved by your honesty. A cracked, honest, thirsty heart offered without pretense will always be received before a polished, guarded heart offered as a performance. I think of this every time I see someone afraid to admit they are struggling in their faith, afraid to admit they sometimes doubt, afraid to admit that a ritual they have performed 1,000 times sometimes feels hollow to them. We have built in so many communities an expectation of constant, unwavering certainty, as if doubt were a disqualification from love, rather than, very often, the doorway into a deeper one. But look again at the mystics. Look at how many of them wrote of dark nights, of feeling abandoned, of crying out into what felt like silence. Their honesty about the difficulty of the path is precisely what makes their eventual nearness to the divine so trustworthy. They did not arrive at love by pretending they never doubted. They arrived at it by being honest about the doubt, and refusing to stop reaching even when their hands closed on nothing. There is a concept in the Sufi path called fana, a word that is often translated as annihilation, though I think that translation frightens people more than it should. It does not mean the destruction of your body or your mind. It means the dissolving of the false self, the anxious, comparing, performing self that spends its whole life defending its own image, so that what remains is something quieter, truer, and paradoxically more fully alive than the noisy self ever was. And after fana, the mystics speak of baka, a kind of return, a coming back into ordinary life, but changed, because now the person moves through the world not as someone desperately trying to prove or protect themselves, but as someone who has already found what they were looking for and is now free simply to live, to love, to serve, to laugh, without that old exhausting hunger driving every decision. I do not say this to suggest that you must achieve some dramatic mystical annihilation before you can feel any peace. Most of us are not going to spend 40 years in the desert like the old ascetics did. But I do think there is a small daily version of fana available to every single one of us, every single day, if we are willing to practice it. It looks like this. For 1 minute, stop trying to be someone. Stop performing competence. Stop performing piety. Stop performing even your own suffering for the sympathy of others, and just be, plainly, quietly, without an audience. That minute, repeated daily, is a small death of the false self, and in that small death, something truer than the performance has room to breathe. I want to say something now about ordinary grief, because I think it matters here more than it might seem to at first. So many people I have met who eventually found something real in their spiritual life did not find it in a moment of triumph. They found it in the middle of loss, the death of a parent, the end of a marriage, the failure of a dream they had built their whole identity around. Loss has a strange gift hidden inside it, a gift none of us would ever ask for, and yet one that keeps arriving anyway. Loss strips away the performance. When you are truly grieving, you do not have the energy left to manage how you appear to others. The mask falls, sometimes for the first time in years, and in that unguarded, exhausted, undignified state, many people report feeling closer to something real than they ever felt in their most polished, composed religious observance. This is not a coincidence. It is, I believe, exactly what the mystics were pointing to when they said the heart must break before the light can enter. Grief breaks it for us when we are not brave enough to break it ourselves through honest surrender. If you are grieving something right now, a person, a version of your life that did not happen, a dream that quietly died somewhere along the way, I want you to know that this ache is not evidence of distance from the divine. In the deepest teaching of the mystics, it may be the very opening you have been searching for in every building you have ever walked into. There is a teaching among the wandering Sufis about the difference between the lamp and the light. A lamp can break. A lamp can be old, cracked, imperfect, even ugly by some standards. But the light that shines through it is untouched by any of that. The light does not become cracked because the lamp is cracked. It simply shines through whatever vessel it is given. You are the lamp. Your body, with all its flaws, all its tiredness, all its history of mistakes and regrets and unfinished business, you are the lamp. And the astonishing claim at the very center of the mystical path is that the light has never once stopped shining through you. Not even during your worst year, not even in your most shameful moment, not even now. While you sit here doubting whether any of this applies to someone like you. It applies to you. It has always applied to you. That is in fact the entire point. Let me tell you one more story before I close, because I think it answers a question you might be silently asking me right now. The practical question, the one underneath all the poetry. You might be thinking, this all sounds beautiful, but how does someone actually live this way? How do I carry a mosque inside my chest while still going to work, still paying bills, still raising children, still standing in traffic with everyone else? The mystics were not naive about this. Many of them were merchants, weavers, farmers, soldiers, mothers, before they were ever called saints. They did not float above ordinary life, they transformed it from within. There is a story of a weaver, a man who spent his days at a loom, passing thread through thread, hour after hour, in a small shop that smelled of dye and dust. A young man came to him wanting to become his student in the spiritual path, expecting perhaps long lessons in scripture, or elaborate breathing exercises, or secret words of power. Instead, the weaver handed him a shuttle, and told him to sit at the loom beside him. Confused, the young man asked when the real teaching would begin. The old weaver said, without looking up from his work, "Watch my hands. Every thread I pass remembering that the one who wove the pattern of the stars is the same one weaving through these fingers now." There is no gap between this work and worship. The gap exists only in your mind, which has decided that God lives in one part of the day, and absence lives in the rest. The young man sat at that loom for years, and it is said he became a teacher himself one day, though he never once left the weaving shop to do it. I love this story because it dismantles a lie so many of us carry without questioning it. The lie that spiritual life and ordinary life are two separate rooms, and we must leave one to enter the other. Under that lie, we spend our days waiting to arrive somewhere holy, before we allow ourselves to feel connected to anything larger than our own worry. We rush through the meal, the commute, the meeting, the argument with a sibling, treating all of it as spiritually neutral time, dead time, time before the real thing begins at the mosque or the temple on the weekend. But the weaver's teaching says otherwise. It says the real thing was never confined to a schedule. It was available in the thread, in the shuttle, in the exact motion of your hands doing whatever it is your hands do all day. What would it look like for you to bring that same attention into your own ordinary hours? not by adding more religious activity to an already exhausted schedule, but by changing the quality of attention you bring to what you are already doing. The way you listen to your child when they are talking to you about something that seems small to you but is enormous to them, that listening, done fully, without your phone in your hand, without your mind halfway in tomorrow's worries, can be a form of prayer more honest than 100 mechanical prostrations. The way you treat a stranger who serves you food, or the driver who nearly cuts you off in traffic, or the co-worker who is having a difficult day and takes it out on you unfairly. The patience or impatience you choose in that ordinary, unremarkable moment is, according to the mystics, far more revealing of your actual nearness to the divine than how elegantly you can recite a prayer you memorized as a child. This is not a small reframing. It is in fact one of the more demanding teachings in the entire mystical tradition, because it removes every excuse. You cannot say, "I will be spiritual once I have more time," because the loom is right in front of you, right now, in whatever form your ordinary life takes today. You cannot say, "I will love more purely once I have resolved my anger at this person," because the resolving of that anger, done honestly, is itself the spiritual work. There is no waiting room before the sacred begins. You are standing inside it right now, in whatever unremarkable room you happen to be sitting in as you listen to these words. I think of how many people spend years feeling like spiritual failures because their outward religious life does not look the way they were told it should. Perhaps they do not pray as often as they were taught to. Perhaps they have not visited every shrine they were told mattered. Perhaps they have wandered far from the tradition they were raised in, and feel a quiet shame about that distance. To all of you carrying that particular shame tonight, I want to offer something the mystics offered again and again to the outcasts, the wanderers, the ones who did not fit neatly into the religious establishment of their time. Nearness to the divine was never a reward for perfect attendance. It was never a prize handed out to whoever followed the most rules most precisely. It was and remains available to anyone honest enough to turn inward and look. The tax collector, the wine seller, the outcast, the heartbroken widow, the doubting scholar. These are exactly the figures the mystical poets kept returning to, not because they were exceptions to the rule, but because their honesty about their own imperfection made them, strangely, more ready to receive something real than the outwardly perfect person who had never once admitted to needing anything at all. So if your path here tonight has been messy, if you have wandered far from wherever you started, if your relationship with mosques and temples has been complicated by disappointment or doubt or simple exhaustion, I do not think that disqualifies you from anything I have said tonight. I think it might actually be your qualification. The door does not ask for your record of attendance. It only asks whether you are finally ready to look. I want to close with something simple, because after all these words, all these stories, all these images of candles and mirrors and burning bushes and broken hearts, I think the truth underneath all of it can be said in one breath. You have spent so much of your life looking outward for a love that has been sitting quietly inside your own chest the whole time, patient as a lamp waiting to be lit, patient as a seed waiting for winter to end. The mosque did not fail you. The temple did not fail you. They were never meant to be the destination. They were meant to be the mirror that reminds you where to actually look. So go, if you want to go. Kneel if you want to kneel. Light the lamp. Ring the bell. Walk the pilgrim's road if your feet are asking for it. There is nothing wrong with any of that, and much that is beautiful in it. But on your way there, and on your way back, and in every ordinary hour in between, remember the one instruction underneath every mystic's teaching, spoken in 1,000 different tongues across 1,000 different centuries. Stop searching so far from home. The door you have been looking for has been standing open inside your own heart the entire time, and it has been waiting, patiently without a single word of complaint, for you to finally walk through it. Close your eyes now, just for a moment, right here wherever you are, not in a mosque, not in a temple, right here, and ask yourself gently, without any judgment at all, what have I been searching for out there, that has been waiting for me all along, in here? That is where I will leave you tonight, not with an answer, because the answer is not mine to give you. It is yours to find, in the quiet, in the stillness, in the very heart you have been carrying with you this entire time, into every mosque, into every temple, into every room you have ever walked into looking for something you never actually had to leave home to find.